Imagine you are a farmer in central Italy. It is the spring of 536 AD. You have spent the morning doing what your father did before you and his father before him, walking the edges of your wheat fields, checking the soil with your fingers, watching the sky for signs of rain. The world you live in is not a bad one. The Western Roman Empire fell 50 years ago, yes, but life goes on. The roads still work. The aqueducts still carry water. The markets in the nearby towns still bustle with traders selling olive oil, wine, salted fish, and linen. You are not rich, but you are not starving. Your children are healthy. Your wife is expecting another one in the autumn. The spring planting went well, and the seeds are in the ground, and now all you need is what you always need, what every farmer in every century has always needed. Sun and rain in the right amounts at the right times, and the patience to wait for the earth to do its work. But something is wrong this morning, something you cannot quite put into words. You noticed it yesterday or maybe the day before, a subtle change in the quality of the light. The sun rose at its usual time, appeared over the eastern hills right on schedule, but it looked different, dimmer, muted, as if someone had draped a thin cloth over it, like the gauze they used to wrap wounds at the military hospital in Ravenna. The shadows it cast were soft and indistinct, not the sharp, clean-edged shadows you are used to seeing on a clear spring morning. And the sky itself was wrong. Not cloudy exactly. There were no rain clouds, no thunderheads building on the horizon. The sky was clear in the sense that you could see from one end of the valley to the other, but it was hazy. A thin, persistent, yellowish haze that hung in the upper atmosphere like smoke from a fire that you could not locate, as if the entire sky had been stained by something invisible and impossibly far away. You stand at the edge of your field and you look up, and you try to tell yourself it is nothing, a trick of the season, an unusual fog that the wind will clear by midday. But midday comes and the haze does not clear. It thickens. The sun, which should be burning hot and bright directly overhead, is a pale disk that you can stare at without squinting, a bluish, sickly circle hanging in a sky that looks like it has been drained of color. Your wife comes out of the house and stands beside you, and you can see in her face that she has noticed it too. The children are playing in the yard, oblivious, but the adults know. Something is happening. Something that has never happened before in living memory, not in your father's time, not in his father's time, not in any story that anyone in the village has ever told around the fire on a winter night. The sun is dying. And nobody, not the priests, not the scholars, not the soldiers, not the emperor himself in his palace in Constantinople 1,000 miles to the east, has any idea why. This is the story of the worst year in human history, not the year with the biggest battle or the most spectacular natural disaster or the most famous assassination. The worst year. The year that started a cascade of suffering so immense, so prolonged, and so far-reaching that its effects would reshape the entire trajectory of human civilization for centuries to come. A year that combined volcanic catastrophe, climate collapse, famine, and the deadliest pandemic the world had ever seen into a single, relentless, years-long nightmare from which there was no escape and no refuge, no matter where you lived, no matter how powerful you were, no matter how much gold you had stored in your vaults, or how many soldiers stood guard at your gates. If you are finding this fascinating and want to go deeper into stories like this, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you never miss one. Because this is a story that most people have never heard, and once you hear it, you will never look at the history of the world the same way again. The year was 536 AD. And what happened was this. A volcano, somewhere on Earth, erupted with such catastrophic force that it injected millions of tons of sulfur dioxide and fine ash particles into the stratosphere, the upper layer of the atmosphere where the air is thin and cold, and where particles, once injected, can remain suspended for months or even years, carried around the entire globe by high-altitude winds, spreading in an invisible, poisonous veil that wraps itself around the planet like a shroud. The sulfur dioxide reacted with water vapor in the stratosphere to form tiny droplets of sulfuric acid, and those droplets, billions upon billions of them, acted as a screen, reflecting sunlight back into space before it could reach the surface of the Earth. The effect was immediate, global, and devastating. Temperatures plummeted. The sun dimmed. Crops failed across 3 continents. And a chain of events was set in motion that would kill millions of people, topple empires, trigger the first great pandemic of bubonic plague, and plunge much of the world into a period of darkness and suffering so profound that we still call it the Dark Ages. The first written accounts of what was happening came from the people who were trained to notice and record unusual events, the scholars, the historians, the government officials whose job it was to document the state of the world for posterity. And their descriptions are chilling, not because of what they say, but because of the confusion and fear that seeps through the careful, measured language they were trained to use. Procopius of Caesarea was the most important historian of the 6th century. He was a legal advisor and military secretary to the great Byzantine general Belisarius, and he spent his career documenting the wars, politics, and events of the Eastern Roman Empire with a level of detail and accuracy that historians still rely on today. Procopius was not a superstitious man. He was educated, rational, skeptical of folklore and miracle stories. When he described the events of 536, he did so in the language of a man who could not believe what he was seeing, but who was too honest to pretend it was not happening. He wrote that for a period of approximately 18 months, the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, during this whole year. He noted that the dimming was not caused by any eclipse, because eclipses last hours, not months. He compared the quality of the light to the light of the moon, pale, cold, insufficient, casting weak shadows that made the world look like a faded painting of itself. 1,000 miles to the west, in the Gothic kingdom of Italy, a man named Cassiodorus was making similar observations. Cassiodorus was a Roman senator and scholar who served as an advisor to the Ostrogothic kings who had taken over the western half of the old Roman Empire. He was one of the most learned men of his age, fluent in Latin and Greek, familiar with the natural philosophy of the classical world, a man who had spent decades reading Pliny and Aristotle and Seneca, and who believed, as educated Romans had always believed, that natural phenomena had natural explanations. But the phenomenon he witnessed in 536 pushed him to the edge of what natural philosophy could explain. He wrote a letter to his subordinates describing what he called a blue-colored sun, a sun that cast no proper shadows even at noon, that provided light but no warmth, that made the days feel like perpetual twilight. He described looking at the moon and finding it empty of splendor, and he noted with evident alarm that the seasons seemed to have changed. Summer, he wrote, had lost its heat. The crops were struggling. The harvest was going to be poor. What neither Procopius nor Cassiodorus could know, because the science to understand it would not exist for another 1,400 years, was that they were living through a volcanic winter. The term itself would not be coined until the 20th century, when climatologists studying the effects of large volcanic eruptions on global climate realized that certain eruptions, the truly massive ones, could inject enough material into the upper atmosphere to cool the entire planet for months or even years. The mechanism is straightforward, but the scale is almost incomprehensible. A major volcanic eruption sends a column of superheated gas, ash, and sulfur dioxide rocketing upward through the atmosphere at speeds that can exceed 700 miles per hour. Most of this material falls back to Earth relatively quickly, within hours or days, settling as ash over the surrounding landscape. But the finest particles, the sulfur dioxide gas in particular, can reach the stratosphere, the layer of the atmosphere that begins roughly 6 to 10 miles above the surface of the Earth. And once there, the rules change completely. In the stratosphere, there is almost no weather in the conventional sense. No rain to wash particles out of the air. No turbulence to bring them back down. Material that reaches the stratosphere stays there, drifting slowly on the high-altitude jet streams that circle the globe, spreading gradually from whatever latitude it was injected at until it forms a thin, continuous layer that wraps around the entire planet. The sulfur dioxide reacts with stratospheric water vapor to form sulfuric acid aerosols, microscopic droplets so small that they float like dust motes in a sunbeam. And those droplets are extraordinarily effective at reflecting incoming solar radiation back into space. They act like a planetary sunscreen, reducing the amount of energy that reaches the Earth's surface, dimming the sun, cooling the air, and disrupting the delicate balance of temperature and moisture on which all agriculture, all ecosystems, and all human civilization depends. The eruption of 536 was not the biggest volcanic eruption in recorded history. It was not even the biggest eruption of the 6th century, as we will discover later. But its timing was catastrophic. It hit a world that was already fragile, already under stress, already stretched to its limits by centuries of political upheaval, military conflict, and economic strain. The Roman world, East and West, was held together by systems of trade, taxation, and governance that had been built during centuries of relative stability, and that depended on predictable harvests, reliable transport networks, and a tax base of farmers who could produce enough surplus grain to feed the cities and pay the armies. When the sun dimmed and the temperatures dropped and the crops began to fail, those systems did not bend. They cracked. And what poured through the cracks would make the volcanic winter look like a minor inconvenience. The cold came quickly, not overnight, but within weeks of the fog's appearance. Temperatures across the northern hemisphere began to drop in ways that no one alive had ever experienced. Modern analysis of tree ring data, the most reliable thermometer we have for reconstructing past climates, tells us that 536 and 537 AD were the coldest years in the northern hemisphere in at least 2,300 years. Dendrochronologists, the scientists who study tree rings, have examined ancient timber from Ireland, Scandinavia, Siberia, and North America, and in all of these widely separated locations, the rings for 536 and the years immediately following are dramatically, unmistakably narrow, sometimes barely visible at all, indicating that the trees experienced growing seasons so short, so cold, and so sunlight-deprived that they barely grew at all. Some trees in the far north stopped growing entirely, producing what scientists call frost rings, rings where the cellular structure shows clear evidence of freezing during what should have been the warmest months of the year. In practical terms, what this meant for the humans living through it was simple and devastating. The crops failed, not partially, not in localized patches where bad luck or poor soil reduced the yield. The crops failed everywhere, simultaneously, across Europe, the Middle East, and into Central Asia and China. Wheat, barley, rye, oats, the staple grains on which the entire caloric economy of the late antique world depended, simply did not receive enough sunlight and warmth to mature. Fields that should have been golden with ripe grain in August and September were instead sparse, stunted, and green, full of plants that had germinated but never reached maturity, plants that were still trying to grow when the first autumn frosts killed them in the ground. The Chinese historical records are particularly vivid. Chinese bureaucrats were meticulous record keepers, far more systematic than their European counterparts, and their dynastic histories contain detailed, year-by-year accounts of weather, harvests, and natural phenomena going back centuries. The records for 536 AD describe summer snow falling in areas where snow in summer was virtually unknown. They describe frosts in August that killed crops across broad swathes of northern China. They describe famine and social unrest, and the movements of desperate populations fleeing from regions where there was nothing left to eat. The Liang dynasty, which controlled southern China at the time, recorded that the skies were darkened and that people were dying of starvation in numbers that overwhelmed the government's ability to provide relief. And here is the thing that made the famine of 536 so much worse than other famines in history. It did not end. Normally, when a harvest fails, people suffer terribly through the winter and spring, but they survive on stored reserves, on foraging, on emergency distributions of grain from government warehouses, and then the next year's harvest comes in and the crisis passes. One bad year is survivable. 2 bad years in a row is desperate. 3 or more is catastrophic. The volcanic aerosol veil from the 536 eruption remained in the stratosphere for approximately 18 months, which meant that the 537 growing season was nearly as bad as 536. Some regions may have experienced slight improvement, but the dimming persisted long enough that many areas lost 2 full harvests in a row. The stored grain reserves that had cushioned the first year's failure were exhausted. The seed grain, the portion of each harvest that farmers set aside for planting the following year, had been eaten out of desperation. Animals that would normally have been kept for breeding had been slaughtered for food. The infrastructure of agricultural production, the carefully maintained system of seeds, livestock, tools, knowledge, and labor on which everything depended, was being consumed by the very people it was supposed to sustain. The social fabric began to tear. In the cities, where people depended entirely on food being shipped in from the countryside, the effects were immediate and brutal. Prices for grains skyrocketed. The poor, who spent the majority of their income on food in the best of times, could no longer afford to eat. Bread riots erupted in cities across the Mediterranean. The government of the Eastern Roman Empire, based in Constantinople, attempted to distribute emergency grain supplies, but the empire's granary, Egypt, was experiencing its own harvest failures, and the ships that normally carried Egyptian grain to Constantinople were arriving with holds that were half empty or less. The army, which depended on regular grain rations to keep its soldiers fed and loyal, began to experience supply shortages that made it increasingly difficult to maintain the military campaigns that Emperor Justinian had launched to reconquer the lost western provinces of the old Roman Empire. And the cold was not just a European problem, it was global. From Ireland to Japan, from Scandinavia to the Arabian Peninsula, the volcanic winter of 536 disrupted agricultural systems, trade networks, and political structures that had been functioning, often quite successfully, for centuries. The Sasanian Empire in Persia, Byzantium's great rival in the East, experienced the same crop failures and the same social stresses. The kingdoms of sub-Saharan Africa felt the effects of disrupted monsoon patterns. The Germanic tribes that had settled in the former Western Roman provinces found their new agricultural holdings suddenly, terrifyingly unproductive. Everywhere, simultaneously, the same story played out. The sun dimmed, the cold came, the harvests failed, and millions of people began the slow, agonizing process of starving to death, while the sky above them remained locked in its eerie, yellowish, perpetual twilight. To understand why the events of 536 were so catastrophic, you need to understand the world that existed before they happened. Because the common assumption, the one that most people absorb without questioning from school textbooks and popular culture, is that the period after the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD was already a time of darkness and decline, a chaotic wasteland of barbarian invasions and crumbling infrastructure, a world that was already falling apart before the volcano finished the job. That assumption is wrong, not just slightly wrong. Profoundly, fundamentally, almost comically wrong. The 6th century, the century in which the catastrophe occurred, was in many ways a golden age. Not everywhere, not for everyone, but the Mediterranean world in the early 500s was a place of remarkable prosperity, cultural achievement, and political ambition on a scale that had not been seen since the height of the Roman Empire centuries earlier. The Eastern Roman Empire, what historians today call the Byzantine Empire, although the people who lived in it would have been baffled by that name since they called themselves Romans and considered their state to be the unbroken continuation of the Roman Empire founded by Augustus, was the richest, most powerful, and most culturally sophisticated state on the planet. Its capital, Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, was the largest city in the world. Home to roughly 500,000 people, protected by the most formidable set of military fortifications ever constructed by human hands, the legendary Theodosian walls, triple lines of towers and ramparts and moats that stretched across the entire width of the peninsula on which the city sat, walls that had never been breached by any besieging army in the city's entire history, and that would not be breached for another 900 years. Not until the Ottoman Turks brought cannons in 1453. The city itself was a wonder, a spectacle, a monument to human ambition and engineering skill that visitors from less developed parts of the world described in terms that bordered on the mystical. Massive churches with gilded domes that caught the sunlight and could be seen from miles out at sea. Public baths heated by underground furnaces that could accommodate thousands of bathers simultaneously, their walls lined with imported marble and their floors decorated with intricate mosaics depicting scenes from mythology and scripture. An enormous hippodrome, modeled on the Circus Maximus in Rome, where chariot races drew crowds of 80,000 screaming, betting, riot-prone spectators divided into fanatical fan groups called the Blues and the Greens, whose rivalries were so intense that they occasionally escalated into full-scale urban warfare. A harbor crammed with merchant vessels from every corner of the known world, ships carrying silk from China along the overland routes of the Silk Road, spices from India via the Red Sea trade, gold from the mines of Africa, grain from the fields of Egypt, amber from the distant shores of the Baltic, and furs from the frozen forests of Russia. And presiding over all of it, directing its armies, shaping its laws, funding its construction projects, and dreaming of even greater glories yet to come, was one of the most ambitious, complicated, and ultimately tragic figures in the history of the world. Flavius Petrus Sabatius Justinianus, Justinian I, Justinian the Great. Justinian was not born to power. He grew up a peasant boy in a remote, dusty province of the Balkans, speaking Latin with a rough provincial accent. The nephew of a common soldier named Justin, who had joined the army as a teenager and fought and politicked, and schemed his way through the ranks until he sat, improbably, on the imperial throne of Constantinople. But Justinian was brilliant, tireless, and consumed by a vision that burned in him like a fever for his entire adult life. The restoration of the Roman Empire to its former glory, the reunification of East and West, the reconstruction of the universal state that had once ruled the entire Mediterranean world and beyond. By 536, the year the sun dimmed, Justinian had already accomplished things that most emperors could only fantasize about. He had reformed the entire legal code of the Roman Empire, producing the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law, a monumental compilation so comprehensive, so carefully organized, and so brilliantly reasoned that it would become the foundation of legal systems across Europe for the next 1,500 years, and that still forms the basis of civil law in dozens of countries today. He had launched a building program of almost lunatic ambition that included the construction of the Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom, a cathedral so enormous, so structurally daring, and so achingly beautiful in its interior spaces that when Justinian walked into the completed building for the first time and looked up at the soaring dome floating above him like a piece of heaven suspended by invisible chains, he is said to have whispered the words, "Solomon, I have surpassed thee." And he had launched the Reconquista, the military campaign to reclaim the lost western provinces of the Roman Empire from the barbarian kingdoms that had divided them up among themselves after the fall of the West. His general, Belisarius, a military genius who is arguably the most talented battlefield commander between Julius Caesar and Napoleon Bonaparte, had already conquered the Vandal kingdom in North Africa in a campaign of breathtaking speed and audacity, and was in the process of invading Ostrogothic Italy with the goal of bringing Rome itself, the eternal city, the symbolic heart of the entire Roman world, back under imperial control. The campaign was going well, better than well. Belisarius was winning. Rome was about to be recaptured. Justinian's dream of a restored, reunified Roman Empire spanning the entire Mediterranean from Spain to Syria was, in 536, closer to becoming reality than it had been at any point since the fall of the Western provinces 60 years earlier. This is the world that the volcanic winter hit, not a world in decline, not a world already collapsing under its own weight, a world at its peak, a world of enormous wealth, extraordinary political ambition, and breathtaking cultural achievement. A world that was, in many ways, more connected, more economically integrated, and more globally interdependent than any world that had existed before it. And that interdependence, that connectivity, those vast trade networks that linked Constantinople to China, Egypt to India, Rome to the coast of the Baltic Sea, would prove to be not a source of resilience in the face of catastrophe, but a vector of catastrophe itself. Because when the plague came, and it was coming, riding silently in the holds of those same ships that carried silk and spices and grain across the Mediterranean, those networks would carry death to every port, every city, every village that they touched. The rats would come ashore. The fleas on the rats would carry a bacterium called Yersinia pestis in their guts. And Yersinia pestis would do something to the world of Justinian, the great, that would make the volcanic winter, the crop failures, and the famine look like nothing more than a warm-up act for the main event. It started with the rats. It almost always starts with the rats. Somewhere in the highlands of Central Asia, in a region that modern scientists believe encompasses parts of what is now Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and the Tian Shan mountain range, a bacterium had been quietly circulating among populations of wild rodents for centuries, maybe millennia. Marmots, gerbils, ground squirrels. Animals that lived in burrows in the dry, cold grasslands of the steppe. Animals that had evolved alongside this particular microbe in a kind of grim equilibrium, dying in small numbers, passing the infection through their colonies in periodic waves, but never breaking out of their remote, sparsely populated habitat because there was nowhere for them to go. The bacterium had a name, though no one in the 6th century would know it for another 1300 years. Yersinia pestis. Named after Alexander Yersin, the French-Swiss bacteriologist who would finally identify it during an outbreak in Hong Kong in 1894, working alone in a bamboo hut near the hospital, ignored by the more established scientists around him, culturing samples from the swollen lymph nodes of dead patients and peering at the rod-shaped organisms through his microscope with the quiet, precise focus of a man who knows he is looking at one of the most efficient killers in the history of life on Earth. But in the 530s, Yersinia pestis did not need a name. It needed a ride, and the volcanic winter of 536 may have given it one. This is still debated among epidemiologists and historians, and the exact mechanism by which the plague escaped its Central Asian reservoir and reached the Mediterranean world is one of the great unsolved puzzles of pandemic history. But one of the most compelling theories goes like this. The climate disruption caused by the volcanic winter destabilized rodent populations across Central Asia. When food becomes scarce, rodent colonies collapse, and when rodent colonies collapse, the fleas that live on those rodents, feeding on their blood, nesting in their fur, need new hosts. The fleas scatter. They jump to other animals, to livestock, to pack animals on the trade caravans that still moved, even through the years of famine and cold, along the ancient routes that connected China to Persia, Persia to the Red Sea to the ports of Egypt. The bacterium traveled inside the flea, specifically inside the flea's gut, where it did something remarkable and horrifying. It multiplied so prolifically that it formed a biological plug, a biofilm that blocked the flea's digestive tract, essentially starving the flea even as it fed. The flea, desperately hungry, would bite its host again and again, and with each bite, it would regurgitate a tiny bolus of plague bacteria directly into the host's bloodstream. A delivery system of almost diabolical efficiency, designed not by any intelligence, but by the blind, pitiless logic of natural selection over hundreds of thousands of years. The bacterium reached the port of Pelusium on the northeastern edge of the Nile Delta sometime around 541 AD, 5 years after the sun went dark. 5 years of famine, crop failure, weakened immune systems, and populations already thinned and debilitated by malnutrition. The timing could not have been worse. Pelusium was not a random backwater. It was one of the most important ports in the entire Mediterranean world, the gateway through which Egyptian grain flowed outward to feed the cities of the Eastern Roman Empire. Ships departed Pelusium and the nearby port of Alexandria constantly, bound for Constantinople, for Antioch, for the coastal cities of Greece and Italy and North Africa, carrying the wheat and barley that kept the empire alive. Those ships carried grain in their holds, and grain attracts rats, and rats carry fleas. And fleas carry Yersinia pestis. Now imagine you are a dockworker in Pelusium. It is the spring of 541. You have survived the worst of the famine years, barely, living on diminished rations and whatever you could scavenge from the harbor markets. You notice, one morning, that there are more dead rats than usual on the waterfront, clustered near the grain warehouses, lying in the gutters, stiff, bloated, some of them with a dark, bloody discharge around their mouths. You kick one aside and keep walking because dead rats in a port city are not unusual. But within a week, people start getting sick. Not the ordinary fevers and stomach complaints that cycle through any crowded port town. Something different, something fast and terrifying. It begins with a sudden fever, a high burning fever that comes on within hours and leaves the victim shaking, confused, drenched in sweat. Then the headaches, blinding headaches that feel like the skull is being squeezed in a vice. And then, within a day or two, the signature horror of the disease appears. The buboes. Swollen lymph nodes, usually in the groin, the armpits, or the neck, that swell rapidly from the size of a pea to the size of an egg, then to the size of an apple, hard, hot, exquisitely painful lumps that distort the body's contours and make every movement agony. The skin over the buboes stretches tight, turns dark, turns purple, sometimes splits open and oozes a mixture of blood and pus that smells like nothing you have ever smelled before. A sweet, cloying, rotting smell that clings to everything it touches, to bed sheets, to clothing, to the hands of anyone who tries to care for the sick. But the buboes are not the worst of it. In some victims, the bacterium enters the bloodstream and triggers septicemic plague, a form of the disease in which the bacteria multiply so explosively in the blood that they overwhelm the body's clotting mechanisms, causing hemorrhages beneath the skin that produce the dark, blackened patches that would later give the disease one of its most terrifying names, the Black Death. The victim's fingers and toes turn black as blood pools and clots in the extremities. Purplish blotches appear across the torso and limbs, spreading like ink stains on wet paper. In the most severe cases, the skin itself begins to die while the patient is still alive, turning gangrenous, sloughing off in sheets. Death from septicemic plague can come within 24 hours, faster than the body can even mount an immune response, so fast that some victims reportedly died before the buboes had time to form. And then there is pneumonic plague, the airborne variant, in which the bacteria colonize the lungs and are coughed out in a fine, bloody aerosol that hangs in the air of enclosed spaces, infecting anyone who breathes it in. Pneumonic plague kills within 1 to 3 days. It is almost 100% fatal without modern antibiotics. In the crowded tenements and boarding houses of a port city like Pelusium, where dock workers and sailors and merchants and their families lived packed together in tight, airless rooms, pneumonic plague would have spread with devastating speed. The grain ships kept sailing. That is the detail that haunts me. The economic machinery of the Eastern Roman Empire demanded that Egyptian grain continue to flow to Constantinople, and no outbreak in a port city, no matter how alarming, was going to stop the shipments that kept the capital fed and the emperor's government functioning. The ships were loaded, the holds sealed, and the vessels put to sea, carrying their cargo of wheat and barley across the blue expanse of the Mediterranean, the crews unaware, or perhaps dimly aware but unable to do anything about it, that they were also carrying passengers in the dark spaces below decks. Rats, nesting in the grain, grooming themselves, scratching at the fleas that bit them, dying one by one as the bacterium worked its way through their tiny bodies. And the fleas, starving now, their guts blocked by the biofilm of Yersinia pestis, abandoned the cooling bodies of their dead hosts and went looking for warm blood. Any warm blood. The blood of the sailors sleeping in their hammocks above the hold. The blood of the dock workers who would unload the grain when the ship reached its destination. The blood of the greatest city on earth. Constantinople was about to receive its shipment. The plague arrived in Constantinople in the spring of 542 AD, approximately 6 years after the volcanic winter had begun. It came by sea, carried in the holds of grain ships from Egypt, the same ships that had been keeping the city fed during the famine years, the same maritime lifeline that the empire depended on for its survival. The bacterium, Yersinia pestis, traveled inside the guts of fleas that lived on the black rats that infested every ship in the Mediterranean fleet. When the ships docked at Constantinople's harbor and the stevedores began unloading the grain, the rats scurried ashore, and the fleas went with them, and the plague entered the greatest city on earth like a thief walking through an unlocked door. The first cases appeared in the poorer neighborhoods near the harbor, among the dock workers, the sailors, the prostitutes, and the beggars who lived in the cramped, rat-infested tenements that lined the waterfront. The symptoms were terrifying. Within days of being bitten by an infected flea, a person would develop a high fever, violent chills, and a crushing headache that made it impossible to think clearly. Then the buboes would appear. Swellings the size of eggs, or sometimes larger, hard, hot, excruciatingly painful lumps that formed in the lymph nodes of the groin, the armpits, and the neck. The buboes would swell until the skin over them turned purple and then black, filled with blood and pus and necrotic tissue. In some patients, the buboes would burst, leaking foul-smelling fluid. In others, the infection would spread to the bloodstream, a condition called septicemic plague, and the patient's skin would turn black all over as the blood vessels beneath it hemorrhaged and died. In the worst cases, the bacteria would reach the lungs, becoming pneumonic plague, and the patient would begin coughing up bloody foam, each cough spraying aerosolized bacteria into the air where they could be inhaled by anyone nearby. Procopius, who was in Constantinople during the outbreak, left an account so detailed and so horrifying that reading it 1,500 years later still makes your skin crawl. He described how the plague progressed through the city neighborhood by neighborhood, street by street, house by house, with a methodical, almost deliberate quality that made it seem less like a disease and more like a living, intelligent predator working its way through a herd. He described how the death toll climbed from dozens per day to hundreds per day to thousands per day until, at the peak of the epidemic, the city was losing between 5,000 and 10,000 people every single day. 10,000 people per day. In a city of 500,000. Let that number sink in for a moment. Imagine waking up every morning knowing that by the time you go to sleep tonight, 10,000 of the people who were alive when the sun rose will be dead. Your neighbors, your colleagues, your friends, the woman who sells bread at the corner, the old man who fixes shoes, the children playing in the alley behind your house. Gone, all of them, day after day after day, for months. The bodies overwhelmed the city's capacity to bury them. Constantinople had cemeteries, of course, but they filled up within weeks. The gravediggers worked around the clock, but they could not dig fast enough, and many of them died of the plague themselves. The government ordered mass graves to be dug outside the city walls, enormous trenches that were filled with corpses and covered with quicklime. But even that was not enough. Bodies were stacked in the streets. They were piled in empty buildings. They were loaded into the towers of the city's defensive walls, the Theodosian walls that had protected Constantinople from every invading army for over a century. Those magnificent towers were turned into charnel houses, stuffed floor to ceiling with decomposing human remains because there was simply nowhere else to put them. Bodies were loaded onto barges and floated out into the Sea of Marmara, where they were dumped overboard and left to the currents and the fish. The stench of decomposition hung over the city like a physical weight, a sweet, choking, inescapable miasma that penetrated every building and every room, and that survivors would remember for the rest of their lives. And through all of it, the sun remained dim. The sky remained hazy. The volcanic winter that had begun in 536 had weakened but not fully dissipated, and the world was still cold, still hungry, still reeling from years of crop failure and famine. The plague was not hitting a healthy, well-fed population. It was hitting a population that had already been starving for 6 years, a population whose immune systems were compromised by chronic malnutrition, whose social infrastructure had already been strained to breaking point by the famine, whose reserves of food, money, and emotional resilience had already been nearly exhausted. The volcanic winter had softened the target, and now the plague was delivering the killing blow. The courts closed, the shops shuttered, the markets emptied. People locked themselves in their homes and refused to come out, not to work, not to buy food, not to attend church, not to bury their dead. The economy of the greatest city on earth ground to a halt. Tax collections stopped. Government administration ceased. The army garrison, depleted by disease, could barely man the walls. And in the great palace, behind the golden mosaics and the silk curtains and the armed guards who stood at every doorway, the most powerful man in the world, the Emperor Justinian himself, the man who had dreamed of restoring Rome to its ancient glory, began to feel the familiar, terrible symptoms. The fever, the headache, the swelling in his groin. The emperor had the plague. Justinian survived. He was one of the lucky ones, if you can call it luck. The plague killed somewhere between 1/4 and 1/2 of the population of Constantinople, depending on whose estimates you trust, and it killed a similar proportion across the broader Mediterranean world. Millions of people died. The emperor, attended by the finest physicians in the world, tended around the clock by servants who risked their own lives to nurse him, managed to fight off the infection. The buboes swelled, the fever raged, and for days the palace held its breath, because if the emperor died without a clear successor, the political chaos that would follow could destroy the empire more thoroughly than the plague itself. But Justinian's immune system, weakened though it was by the years of famine and stress, was strong enough. The fever broke. The buboes receded. The emperor rose from his sickbed and returned to the throne. But the man who returned was not the same man who had fallen ill. The Justinian who emerged from the plague was diminished, cautious, haunted by what he had witnessed, and the empire he returned to govern was a shadow of the one he had been building before the catastrophe. The numbers alone tell the story. Constantinople's population had been cut roughly in half. The tax base, the money that funded the armies and the building projects and the civil service that held the empire together, had collapsed. You cannot tax the dead, and you cannot collect revenue from farms that have no one left to work them. Entire villages in the countryside had been wiped out completely, every single inhabitant dead or fled, the houses standing empty, the fields going to seed, the animals wandering loose until they died of neglect or were taken by predators. The infrastructure of the empire, the roads, the aqueducts, the harbors, the postal system, all of it required constant maintenance by a workforce that no longer existed in sufficient numbers. And the military consequences were devastating. Belisarius, Justinian's greatest general, the man who had been on the verge of completing the reconquest of Italy, was recalled from the front. His army had been ravaged by the plague. Reinforcements were impossible to find because the recruiting pool had been decimated. The campaigns in Italy, which had been going brilliantly, ground to a halt and then reversed. The Ostrogoths, who had been on the verge of defeat, rallied and counterattacked, and the war that Justinian had expected to win quickly turned into a grinding, ruinous, 20-year slog that devastated the Italian peninsula far more thoroughly than any barbarian invasion had done. By the time it was finally over, Italy was a wasteland. Rome itself had been besieged and sacked multiple times. The population of the city, which had once numbered over 1 million, had fallen to perhaps 20 or 30,000. A few thousand survivors huddled in the ruins of what had been the greatest city in the history of the world. Justinian's dream died with the plague, not in a single dramatic moment, not in a decisive battle or a spectacular defeat, but slowly, gradually bled to death by the relentless attrition of disease and depopulation. The Reconquista achieved its territorial objectives, technically. Belisarius and his successors did recapture North Africa, Italy, and parts of Spain. But the reconquered territories were depopulated, impoverished, and impossible to hold without military forces that the plague had destroyed. Within a generation of Justinian's death, in 565 AD, most of the reconquered territories would be lost again, this time permanently. The Lombards would take most of Italy. The Visigoths would reclaim Spain. The Berber tribes would chip away at North Africa. The unified Roman Empire that Justinian had spent his life trying to restore was a fantasy killed not by any human enemy, but by a bacterium that was smaller than a speck of dust, and that had been carried to his capital in the belly of a flea, on the back of a rat, in the hold of a grain ship. The plague did not stop at the borders of the Byzantine Empire. It spread outward along every trade route, every sea lane, every road, and every river that connected the Mediterranean world to its neighbors. The Sasanian Empire in Persia was hit with equal ferocity, its cities and provinces gutted by the same disease, its military capacity degraded in exactly the same way that Byzantium's had been. The plague traveled along the Silk Road deep into Central Asia, riding the camel caravans that carried silk and spices between the Chinese frontier and the markets of the Mediterranean. It crossed the Red Sea and devastated the Arabian Peninsula and the Horn of Africa. It reached the Germanic kingdoms that had established themselves in the former Western Roman provinces, killing Franks and Visigoths and Lombards with the same indifference it showed toward Greeks and Persians and Egyptians. It crossed the English Channel and reached Britain, where it found a population already reeling from the effects of the volcanic winter and the collapse of what remained of post-Roman civilization. Everywhere the grain ships and the merchant caravans went, the rats went with them, and the fleas went with the rats, and the plague followed the fleas with the methodical, patient, terrifying efficiency of a predator that had all the time in the world and no intention of stopping until it had visited every human settlement within reach. The total death toll of the plague of Justinian over the course of its initial outbreak and its subsequent waves of recurrence that continued for over 2 centuries is estimated at between 25 and 50 million people. To put that in perspective, the total population of the entire Roman world at its peak was roughly 60 to 70 million. The plague killed roughly a third of everyone in the known world, and it was only one part of the catastrophe. Because while the plague was working its way through the human population of 3 continents, the volcanoes had not finished. There is a strange and haunting footnote to the catastrophe of the 6th century that most histories barely mention, and it involves a place and a time that seems very far from Constantinople and the Mediterranean and the world of Justinian. It involves Britain. Post-Roman Britain, to be specific, the wild, fragmented, war-torn island that the Romans had abandoned in 410 AD, and that had been struggling ever since to maintain some semblance of civilized life in the face of constant invasion, internal warfare, and the slow, painful collapse of every institution and infrastructure that the Romans had built during their 3.5 centuries of occupation. By 536, Britain was already a broken land. The cities that the Romans had built were largely abandoned, their forums and bathhouses and amphitheaters crumbling into ruin, their aqueducts choked with weeds, their straight, well-engineered roads still usable but no longer maintained, cracking and eroding a little more with every passing winter. The native Britons, the Celtic-speaking Romano-British population that had adopted Roman customs and considered itself part of the Roman world, were fighting a desperate, losing war against waves of Germanic invaders from across the North Sea. The Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, fierce, pagan warrior peoples, who had been raiding and settling the eastern coast of Britain for over a century, and who were gradually pushing the native population westward into the hills of Wales, the moors of Cornwall, and the mountains of the north. And here is where the history gets entangled with legend in a way that makes it impossible to separate fact from fiction with any confidence. The Welsh Annals, a medieval document that compiles historical records and traditions from the early centuries of British history, record that in 537 AD, 1 year after the volcanic winter began, a great battle took place at a place called Camlan. And at Camlan, according to the annals, 2 men fell, Arthur and Medrawd. Arthur and Mordred, the great king and his treacherous nephew, locked in their final fatal combat on a field shrouded in mist and blood. The death of Arthur, the end of Camelot, the passing of the Golden Age, the beginning of the darkness. Now let us be very careful here. there is no reliable historical evidence that King Arthur existed as a real, specific individual. The Arthurian legend as we know it, the Round Table, the Sword in the Stone, Lancelot and Guinevere and the Holy Grail, was largely a creation of medieval romance writers who were working hundreds of years after the events they described, and who were far more interested in telling a good story than in recording accurate history. But most historians agree that the Arthurian legend is probably based, at least loosely, on a real historical tradition of British resistance to the Anglo-Saxon invasions in the late 5th and early 6th centuries. There may have been a war leader, perhaps a Romano-British cavalry commander, perhaps a local king, who achieved some notable victories against the Saxons and whose memory was preserved and gradually embellished by later storytellers until it became the elaborate mythology that we know today. And the timing is extraordinary. 537 AD, 1 year after the sun dimmed, 1 year into the worst volcanic winter in over 2 millennia. The crops were failing. The cold was settling in. The dimming of the sun, that eerie, persistent, yellowish haze that turned midday into twilight, would have been visible in Britain just as clearly as it was visible in Italy and Constantinople. Imagine what that must have felt like to people living in a land that was already collapsing, already at war, already losing its fight against the invaders. The sun going dark, the harvests failing, and then the death of the last great defender, the last hero, the last king. It would have felt like the end of the world, and in a very real sense, it was. The sub-Roman British civilization that had survived the withdrawal of the legions by over a century finally collapsed in the decades following 536, overwhelmed by famine, plague, and the relentless pressure of the Anglo-Saxon expansion. The Britons retreated into the western and northern margins of the island, and the Angles and Saxons took possession of the fertile lowlands that would eventually bear their name, Angleland, England. The fact that the Arthurian legend places the death of Arthur in the exact year that the volcanic winter struck Britain may be coincidence. It probably is coincidence, but it is the kind of coincidence that makes you wonder whether the memory of that terrible year, the year the sun died and the crops failed and the last king fell, was somehow woven into the fabric of the legend itself, preserved in the same way that other cultures preserved the memory of catastrophic events through myth and story. The darkness of Camelot's fall, the sense of an irreversible ending, the feeling that a golden age has passed and will never return, those themes resonate with an intensity that goes beyond mere storytelling. They feel like they are remembering something real, something terrible, something that happened when the sun turned blue and the world went cold, and everything that had been built over centuries crumbled into dust and legend. But Britain was only one small corner of the world that was suffering. On the other side of the planet, in the great empires and kingdoms of East Asia, the same volcanic winter was producing effects that were, if anything, even more dramatic. And in Central America, deep in the tropical jungles of what is now El Salvador, the earth was preparing to deliver yet another blow. The Chinese records for 536 AD are blunt and devastating. The dynastic histories of the period, compiled by court historians whose job was to record every significant event that affected the empire, describe weather so extreme that it reads like science fiction. Summer snow, frost in June and July, harvests that failed completely across provinces that normally produced enough grain to feed tens of millions of people. The Liang dynasty, which controlled southern China during this period, recorded widespread famine and civil unrest as hungry populations turned on their local officials, demanding food that did not exist. The Northern Wei dynasty, which controlled the north, experienced similar catastrophes, and the political instability caused by the famine contributed directly to the dynasty's eventual collapse and fragmentation into rival states that would fight among themselves for decades. The Silk Road, that legendary network of trade routes that connected China to the Mediterranean world, carrying silk, spices, precious metals, horses, and ideas across thousands of miles of steppe, desert, and mountain, was devastated. Trade depends on stability, on the ability to move goods safely from one point to another along routes that are policed and maintained and free from banditry and warfare. When the famine struck and the social order began to crack, that stability evaporated. Caravans were attacked by desperate, starving populations. Oasis cities that had served as crucial rest stops and trading posts along the route were depopulated or abandoned. The flow of goods between East and West, which had been one of the great engines of cultural exchange and economic prosperity for centuries, slowed to a trickle and in some sections stopped entirely. And then in 540 AD, 4 years after the first eruption had dimmed the sun, a second volcano erupted. If the first eruption was a body blow, the second was a knockout punch. This eruption was not in the northern hemisphere, not in Iceland or wherever the 536 eruption had originated. This one was tropical. It was in Central America, in what is now El Salvador, and it was vastly, terrifyingly more powerful than the first. The volcano was Ilopango, a massive caldera that sits in the highlands of central El Salvador, roughly 10 miles east of the modern capital, San Salvador. Today, the caldera contains a picturesque lake, a popular tourist destination surrounded by green hills and coffee plantations. It looks peaceful, benign, the kind of place where families go for Sunday picnics. But beneath that serene surface lies one of the most dangerous and destructive volcanoes in the Western Hemisphere, and in approximately 540 AD, it erupted with a violence that is difficult to comprehend. The eruption, known to geologists as the Tierra Blanca Joven event, was classified as a VEI 7, a volcanic explosivity index rating that puts it in the same category as the most powerful eruptions in recorded human history. To put that in context, the eruption of Mount Vesuvius that buried Pompeii was a VEI 5. The eruption of Krakatoa in 1883 was a VEI 6. Ilopango was 10 times more powerful than Krakatoa. The eruption column, the superheated plume of gas, ash, and rock that blasted vertically out of the caldera, rose to an estimated altitude of 25 to 30 miles, punching through the troposphere and deep into the stratosphere. Pyroclastic flows, ground-hugging avalanches of superheated gas and volcanic debris traveling at hundreds of miles per hour, swept outward from the caldera in every direction, incinerating everything in their path for distances of up to 30 miles or more. The entire central region of what is now El Salvador was buried under a layer of volcanic ash and pumice that in some places reached depths of over 50 feet. The Maya civilization, which dominated Central America at the time, was catastrophically affected. Cities and settlements within a radius of roughly 100 miles of Ilopango were simply obliterated, erased from the map, buried under volcanic ash so deep that the landscape was rendered completely uninhabitable for generations. Populations that had occupied the region for centuries were killed outright by the pyroclastic flows or forced to flee as refugees, triggering massive migrations that disrupted Maya political and economic systems across a wide area of Mesoamerica. Archaeological evidence shows a sudden, dramatic depopulation of the Salvadoran highlands and a corresponding increase in population in surrounding regions, as survivors streamed outward from the devastated zone in search of food, shelter, and land that was not buried under 50 feet of ash. And the global effects were, if anything, even worse than the regional devastation. The millions of tons of sulfur dioxide that Ilopango injected into the stratosphere joined the remnants of the 536 eruptions aerosol veil, which had not yet fully dissipated after 4 years, and created a renewed, intensified period of atmospheric dimming and cooling that extended the volcanic winter by years. The coldest decade in 2,300 years, which had begun with the 536 eruption, was doubled down upon by Ilopango in 540. The planet was hit by a second massive volcanic winter before it had even begun to recover from the first. And then, in 547, a third eruption, its source still not conclusively identified, added yet another layer of volcanic aerosols to an atmosphere that was already choking with sulfuric acid droplets. 3 eruptions in 11 years. 3 separate, independent geological events that by pure coincidence, by a piece of cosmic bad luck so extreme that it seems almost malevolent, occurred in the same narrow window of time and combined their effects into a single, prolonged, relentless assault on the Earth's climate system. The result was a period of cooling so extended and so severe that scientists have given it its own name, the Late Antique Little Ice Age. And it would last, not for years, but for more than a century. The Late Antique Little Ice Age lasted from roughly 536 to 660 AD. Over a century of depressed temperatures, disrupted weather patterns, shortened growing seasons, and recurring famines that kept the world's population suppressed and its civilizations on their knees. It was not a continuous, unbroken period of extreme cold. There were fluctuations, better years and worse years, partial recoveries followed by renewed cooling as the effects of the 536, 540, and 547 eruptions gradually dissipated from the stratosphere, but continued to influence global climate through complex feedback mechanisms involving ocean currents, sea ice, and atmospheric circulation patterns. But the overall trend was unmistakable. The world was colder, the harvests were poorer, and the civilizations that had dominated the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and Central Asia were being reshaped by forces that no human being could control or even understand. The political consequences of this extended period of climate stress are so vast, so far-reaching, and so deeply embedded in the structure of the modern world that it is almost impossible to overstate their importance. Here is the short version. The 2 superpowers that dominated the Old World in 536 AD were the Byzantine Empire and the Sasanian Persian Empire. These 2 colossal states had been rivals for centuries, fighting intermittent wars along their shared frontier in the Middle East, while simultaneously maintaining the trade networks and diplomatic relationships that connected the Mediterranean world to Central Asia and beyond. In 536, both of them were strong, wealthy, and militarily formidable. By 650, a little over a century later, both of them were devastated. The Byzantine Empire had lost roughly half its territory and more than half its population. The Sasanian Empire had been destroyed entirely, conquered and absorbed by a new power that had emerged from one of the least likely places on the map. The Arabian Peninsula, in the 6th century, was considered a backwater, a vast, arid, sparsely populated expanse of desert and semi-desert, inhabited primarily by nomadic Bedouin tribes who herded camels and sheep and raided each other's camps in an endless cycle of small-scale warfare that the great empires of Byzantium and Persia barely noticed. The cities of the Hijaz, Mecca and Medina were modest trading centers, important for their role in the incense trade and as pilgrimage destinations, but not comparable in size, wealth, or military power to Constantinople or Ctesiphon. Nobody in 536 AD would have predicted that within 100 years, the Arabian Peninsula would produce a civilization that would conquer both the Byzantine and Sasanian empires, sweep across North Africa, cross the Straits of Gibraltar, and establish a domain stretching from Spain to the borders of China. But that is exactly what happened, and the catastrophe that began in 536 played a direct, measurable role in making it possible. The volcanic winter, the famines, and the plague weakened both Byzantium and Persia in ways from which they never fully recovered. The plague in particular was devastating to both empires, reducing their populations, crippling their economies, and degrading their military capabilities at exactly the moment when they needed to be strongest. In the early 7th century, the two exhausted empires fought one final, ruinous war against each other, a conflict that lasted over 25 years and that left both of them so weakened, so depleted of men and money and political cohesion, that when the Arab armies emerged from the desert in the 630s under the banner of Islam, they encountered resistance that was a fraction of what it would have been a century earlier. The Byzantine frontier defenses in Syria and Palestine, which had been among the most formidable in the world before the catastrophe, were now thinly manned by demoralized garrisons and backed by a treasury that was nearly empty. The Sasanian military, which had been one of the most feared fighting forces in Western Asia, had been so depleted by plague, famine, and decades of war with Byzantium that it collapsed almost completely in the face of the Arab advance. The rise of Islam and the Arab conquests are among the most consequential events in human history. They transformed the political, cultural, linguistic, and religious landscape of an enormous swath of the planet, from Morocco to Indonesia, in ways that persist to this day. And while the primary causes of these events were, of course, religious, cultural, military, and political, the enabling condition, the thing that made it possible for a relatively small, militarily modest population from the Arabian Peninsula to overwhelm two of the mightiest empires in the world within a single generation, was the century-long catastrophe that had begun with a volcanic eruption in 536 AD. The volcano did not cause the rise of Islam, but it created the world in which the rise of Islam was possible. This is the thing that makes the catastrophe of 536 so different from other historical disasters, so much more significant than a single earthquake or a single battle or a single epidemic, no matter how devastating. It was not a single event. It was a cascade. Volcanic winter led to famine. Famine led to weakened immune systems and social breakdown. Social breakdown enabled the rapid spread of plague. Plague destroyed populations and economies. Weakened empires fought exhausting wars they could not afford. And in the rubble left behind, New powers rose to reshape the world in ways that the victims of 536 could never have imagined. For 1400 years after it happened, nobody knew what had caused the catastrophe of 536. The eyewitnesses knew that the sun dimmed. They knew that the weather turned devastatingly cold. They knew that the crops failed across entire continents and that a plague of unprecedented ferocity swept through the Mediterranean world and killed a staggering percentage of the human population. But as for what had actually caused the sun to lose its brightness and the sky to fill with that eerie, persistent, yellowish haze, they had absolutely no idea. None, not a clue. Procopius and Cassiodorus described what they saw with remarkable clarity and detail, but neither man had the scientific framework to explain it. Some thinkers of the era blamed divine punishment, the righteous wrath of God unleashed upon a sinful and ungrateful humanity. Others suspected some kind of disturbance in the cosmic order, a passing comet whose tail had poisoned the upper air, or a shift in the celestial spheres that had weakened the sun's fire. A few speculated about volcanic eruptions, because educated Romans knew that volcanoes could darken the sky with ash, but no eruption large enough to explain 18 months of dimming had been observed anywhere in the known world, and the mystery remained unresolved, gathering dust in the margins of history like an old, unsolved crime case that nobody was actively working on anymore. The breakthrough, when it finally came, arrived not from the study of ancient texts or archaeological sites, but from ice. Specifically, from ice cores drilled out of the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets by modern climate scientists who were looking for something else entirely. Ice cores are one of the most remarkable scientific tools ever devised by human ingenuity. When snow falls on the polar ice sheets, it accumulates in layers, one layer per year, each annual layer separated from the ones above and below by subtle differences in crystal structure, density, and chemical composition that allow trained scientists to count them like tree rings and assign each one to a specific calendar year. As the layers are buried and compressed by the weight of subsequent snowfalls, they become denser, transforming from fluffy surface snow into compacted firn and eventually into solid glacial ice. And as they transform, they preserve a detailed year-by-year record of the atmosphere at the time the snow fell. Tiny air bubbles trapped in the ice contain samples of the ancient atmosphere, preserving the exact concentration of carbon dioxide, methane, and other gases from centuries or millennia ago. Dust particles and chemical compounds deposited on the surface by wind and volcanic fallout and industrial pollution are locked into each annual layer like entries in a frozen diary that spans hundreds of thousands of years. By drilling down through the ice sheet and extracting long cylindrical cores, sometimes reaching depths of 2 miles or more, scientists can read that diary backward through time, year by year, century by century, millennium by millennium, reconstructing the chemical history of the Earth's atmosphere with a precision and chronological resolution that no other archive on the planet can match. And in the early 2000s, a team led by Paul Mayuski of the University of Maine and the historian Michael McCormick of Harvard University did something that no one had done before. They analyzed a section of an ice core from the Kolnifty Glacier in the Swiss Alps, a high-altitude glacier that sits at roughly 15,000 feet in the Monte Rosa Massif, and they focused specifically on the annual layers corresponding to the period around 536 AD. What they found in those layers was unmistakable and devastating. A massive spike of sulfate deposits in the annual layers corresponding to 536, a concentration of sulfuric acid so high that it dwarfed the background levels of the surrounding years like a skyscraper rising from a flat plain. This was the chemical fingerprint of a major volcanic eruption, sulfur dioxide injected into the stratosphere, converted to sulfuric acid aerosols, and then gradually settling out of the upper atmosphere over the following months and years, falling as microscopic droplets onto the surface of the glacier where they were preserved in the ice for 15 centuries. But the 536 spike was not alone. Below it, in the layers corresponding to approximately 540 AD, there was another spike, almost as large, almost as dramatic, a second massive eruption only 4 years after the first. And below that, in the layers around 547, a third. 3 distinct eruptions, 3 catastrophic injections of volcanic material into the upper atmosphere, packed into a single 11-year window. It was as if the planet itself had decided to wage war on the human species, firing volley after volley of atmospheric poison into the sky in a bombardment that lasted more than a decade. And mixed in with those sulfate deposits, the research team found something even more valuable: microscopic particles of volcanic glass, tiny shards of solidified magma, each one smaller than a grain of sand, each one carrying a chemical fingerprint that could potentially be matched to a specific volcano, a specific eruption, a specific moment in geological history. The question was no longer whether a volcano had caused the catastrophe of 536. The ice cores had answered that question definitively. The question now was which volcano, and that question would lead the researchers on a trail that stretched from the glaciers of Switzerland to the ice sheets of Greenland to a massive, terrifying caldera in the jungles of Central America. The story of how the world recovered from the catastrophe of 536 is, in its own quiet way, almost as remarkable as the story of the catastrophe itself, because the world did recover. Not quickly, not completely, not evenly, but gradually over decades and centuries. The forests grew back, the populations rebuilt, the trade networks reformed, and the civilizations that had been shattered by volcanic winter, famine, and plague found new shapes, new structures, new ways of organizing themselves that were different from what had come before, but that were in many cases more resilient, more adaptable, and more capable of surviving future shocks. The evidence for the recovery comes from the same place that the evidence for the catastrophe came from: the ice cores. Paul Mayuski's team, analyzing the Kolnifty Glacier core layer by layer, found something fascinating in the annual layers corresponding to approximately 640 AD, roughly a century after the catastrophe began. A sudden, dramatic increase in lead pollution. Lead in the atmosphere. Lead deposited on the surface of the glacier in quantities that dwarfed the background levels of previous centuries. And lead, in the pre-industrial world, meant one thing: silver smelting. When medieval metallurgists smelted silver ore, a process that involved heating the raw ore in furnaces until the silver separated from the lead with which it was naturally alloyed. The lead evaporated and was released into the atmosphere as a fine aerosol. That aerosol traveled on the winds, crossed borders and mountain ranges, and settled on the surface of glaciers, where it was preserved for future scientists to find. The return of lead pollution in the ice cores around 640 AD was, in other words, a signal that the European economy was restarting, that mines were reopening, that furnaces were being fired up again, that silver was being smelted in quantities large enough to leave a detectable chemical trace in the atmosphere, that the long, dark, terrible century that had begun with the dimming of the sun was finally, tentatively, cautiously coming to an end. People were trading again, building again, mining again. The gears of civilization, which had ground to a halt during the worst of the catastrophe, were slowly, creakily beginning to turn once more. But the world that emerged from the late antique Little Ice Age was a fundamentally different world from the one that had entered it. The classical world of the Mediterranean, the world of Rome and Byzantium, and the great trade networks that had linked the entire Old World into a single economic system, was gone. Or rather, it was diminished, contracted, reduced to a shadow of what it had been. The Western Roman provinces were now a patchwork of Germanic kingdoms that owed nothing to Rome except the roads they traveled on and the ruins they sometimes lived in. The Byzantine Empire survived, but was a fraction of its former size, clinging to its capital and a handful of territories around the eastern Mediterranean, surrounded by enemies, perpetually on the defensive. The Sasanian Empire was gone entirely, replaced by the vast, dynamic, rapidly expanding Islamic Caliphate that would dominate the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia for centuries to come. And here is something that most people never think about, but that changes the way you understand the entire history of the medieval world. The term Dark Ages, the phrase that is used to describe the period in European history between roughly the 6th century and the 10th century, a period characterized by economic stagnation, cultural decline, political fragmentation, population loss, and a general sense that the lights of civilization had gone out. That term is usually treated as a metaphor, a figure of speech. A way of saying that this was a period of intellectual and cultural darkness, when learning declined and barbarism prevailed. But the term may have started as something much more literal than that. The Dark Ages began in 536, the year the sun literally went dark, the year the sky turned hazy and yellow, and the sun became a pale, cold, shadowy disk that cast no proper shadows and provided no proper warmth. The darkness that descended on the world in 536 was real, physical, measurable, and it lasted for years. And the social, political, and economic darkness that followed it lasted for centuries. We call them the Dark Ages because they were dark, not just metaphorically, literally. The sun went out, the crops died, the plague came, and the world that emerged from the other side of the catastrophe was so diminished, so depopulated, so impoverished, so reduced in every measurable way from what had existed before, that the people living in it must have felt like they were living in the ruins of a world that had once been bright and warm and full of possibility, but that was now, for reasons that nobody could explain, cold and dark and haunted by the ghosts of everything that had been lost. The great public baths of the Roman world fell into disrepair and were never rebuilt, because there was no one left to maintain the aqueducts that fed them and no tax revenue to pay for their upkeep. The literacy rates that had been relatively high in the late Roman world collapsed, because the schools closed and the teachers died and the libraries were abandoned. Long-distance trade, which had brought silk from China and spices from India, to the markets of Rome and Constantinople, shrank to a fraction of its former volume, because the ships rotted and the ports silted up, and the populations that had produced and consumed those goods were gone. The physical infrastructure of Roman civilization, the roads and bridges and harbors and walls that had connected an empire spanning 3 continents, crumbled slowly under the combined assault of neglect, weather, and time. And yet, even in the ruins, even in the darkness, the recovery was beginning. Slowly, imperceptibly, like the first green shoots pushing through the ash after a forest fire. The world was rebuilding itself, one silver ingot, one plowed field, one newborn child at a time. And the question that remains, the question that keeps historians and climate scientists up at night, is whether something like this could ever happen again. The answer is yes. Of course it could happen again. The volcanoes that caused the catastrophe of 536 are still there. They are still active. They are still producing magma in the deep chambers beneath the Earth's crust, still building pressure, still waiting for the next eruption, and they are not the only ones. The planet is studded with volcanoes that are capable of producing eruptions of the same magnitude as the ones that darkened the sun in the 6th century, and several of them are capable of producing eruptions that are vastly larger. The most famous is Yellowstone. The Yellowstone caldera, located beneath Yellowstone National Park in the northwestern United States, is a supervolcano, a volcanic system so large that its eruptions are measured not in cubic miles of lava, but in cubic miles of pyroclastic material, the superheated mixture of gas, ash, and pulverized rock that a volcanic explosion ejects into the atmosphere. Yellowstone has erupted catastrophically 3 times in the last 2 million years, at intervals of roughly 600,000 to 700,000 years. The most recent eruption, roughly 640,000 years ago, was a VEI 8, 1,000 times more powerful than the eruption of Mount St. Helens in 1980. It ejected approximately 240 cubic miles of material, enough to bury the entire state of Texas under 5 feet of ash. If Yellowstone were to erupt at that scale today, the immediate destruction would be confined to the western United States, but the global climatic effects would be catastrophic, potentially plunging the entire planet into a volcanic winter far more severe and far longer lasting than anything that happened in 536 AD. But you do not need a supervolcano to create a global catastrophe. The eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia in 1815, a VEI 7, roughly the same magnitude as the Ilopango eruption of 540 AD, produced what became known as the Year Without a Summer in 1816. Temperatures across the northern hemisphere dropped by several degrees. Crops failed across Europe and North America. Famine and food riots erupted in multiple countries. In Switzerland, the cold, gloomy, sunless summer of 1816 drove a group of writers to stay indoors by the fire at a villa on Lake Geneva, where they passed the time telling each other ghost stories. One of them, a young woman named Mary Shelley, used the inspiration of that dark, unnatural summer to write a novel about a scientist who creates a living creature from dead body parts. She called it Frankenstein. Another, Lord Byron, wrote a poem called Darkness that begins with the line, "I had a dream, which was not all a dream, the bright sun was extinguished." They were writing about 1816, but they could have been writing about 536. The difference between the world of 536 and the world of today is not that we are less vulnerable. In many ways, we are more vulnerable. Our global food system is more interconnected, more optimized, more dependent on just-in-time supply chains and narrow margins of surplus than any food system in human history. A volcanic winter that reduced global agricultural output by even 20 or 30% for 2 or 3 consecutive years would create a famine of unprecedented proportions in the modern world, not because we lack the technology to grow food, but because our systems are designed for efficiency, not resilience. There are no vast government granaries stockpiling years of surplus grain the way the Romans stockpiled grain in Egypt. Global grain reserves at any given time represent roughly 3 to 4 months of consumption. A 2-year disruption to global harvests would exhaust those reserves within the first year, and the resulting food shortages would affect billions, not millions, of people. And the plague dimension has its own modern parallel. The COVID-19 pandemic demonstrated with brutal clarity how quickly a novel pathogen can spread through a globally connected world, and how poorly prepared even wealthy, technologically advanced nations can be in the face of a pandemic. A volcanic winter in the modern world would not just disrupt food supplies. It would disrupt medical supply chains, reduce access to clean water, weaken immune systems through malnutrition, and create exactly the conditions of crowding, displacement, and desperation in which epidemic diseases thrive. We have antibiotics now, which the Romans did not, and vaccines and modern epidemiology. But we also have 8 billion people, densely packed into cities, connected by air travel, and dependent on fragile systems that the people of 536 could not have imagined. The lesson of 536 is not that we are doomed. It is that we are not as safe as we think we are. The Earth is a violent, dynamic, unpredictable system that operates on timescales that make human civilizations look like mayflies, brief, beautiful, and heartbreakingly fragile. The volcanoes do not care about our stock markets, or our elections, or our smartphone apps, or our carefully constructed illusions of control. They are operating on their own schedule, driven by forces that we can monitor but cannot control. And when one of them decides to erupt on the scale that produced the catastrophe of 536, there is nothing we can do to stop it. We cannot predict when the next major eruption will occur. Volcanologists can monitor seismic activity, gas emissions, and ground deformation at known volcanoes, and they can sometimes provide warnings of days or weeks before an eruption, but they cannot predict the timing of eruptions with any reliability on the scale of decades or centuries. The next VEI-7 eruption could happen tomorrow. It could happen in 1,000 years. We simply do not know. And the only question that matters, the only question that the catastrophe of 536 leaves us with, is whether we will be better prepared than the Romans were, or whether we will make the same discovery they made, that our civilization, for all its magnificence, for all its technology, for all its arrogant confidence in its own permanence, is built on a foundation that can crack open at any moment and swallow everything we have built. There is one more dimension to the story of 536 that deserves attention before we reach the end, and it is a dimension that has nothing to do with volcanoes or plagues or empires, and everything to do with how we think about history itself. Because the catastrophe of 536 is not just a story about something that happened 1,500 years ago. It is a story about how much of history we have simply missed. How many critical events, how many pivotal turning points, how many world-changing catastrophes occurred in the past without being recognized, without being recorded, without being understood, because the science and the tools needed to detect them did not exist until very recently. Think about this for a moment. The catastrophe of 536 AD was one of the most significant events in the last 2,000 years of human history. It triggered the worst famine in recorded history. It killed a third of the population of the known world through plague. It toppled empires. It reshaped the political map of 3 continents. It literally created the Dark Ages, and nobody knew what had caused it. For 1400 years, nobody knew. The eyewitnesses who lived through it wrote about the dimming and the cold and the plague, but they could not explain the cause. Later historians read those accounts and largely ignored them, treating the references to dimmed suns and mysterious fogs as literary exaggerations or religious metaphors rather than descriptions of real physical phenomena. The catastrophe of 536 was hidden in plain sight, recorded in the historical sources, but invisible to historians who did not have the conceptual framework to recognize what they were reading. It was not until the 1980s and 1990s when ice core scientists and dendrochronologists began systematically mapping past volcanic eruptions and their climatic effects that the pieces finally came together. Not until an archaeologist and a glaciologist sat down together in a lab at Harvard and looked at a section of ice core from a Swiss glacier and realized that the spikes of sulfuric acid they were seeing in the layers around 536 AD perfectly matched the historical descriptions of dimmed suns and failed harvests that had been sitting in libraries for 15 centuries, waiting for someone with the right tools and the right questions to connect them. How many other catastrophes are hiding in the historical record right now, invisible because we do not yet have the tools to see them? How many times has the Earth done something, a volcanic eruption, a cosmic impact, a sudden release of methane from the ocean floor, a shift in ocean circulation patterns that devastated human civilizations and reshaped the course of history in ways that we have not yet detected because the evidence is buried in ice cores we have not yet drilled, or preserved in tree rings we have not yet analyzed, or recorded in historical texts that we have not yet learned to read correctly? The history of the Earth is full of catastrophes, full of sudden, violent disruptions that arrive without warning and that change everything. We know about the ones that left obvious physical evidence: the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs, the eruption of Vesuvius that buried Pompeii. But the ones that worked through climate, through the slow, invisible, relentless mechanisms of stratospheric aerosol veils, and disrupted weather patterns and cascading crop failures, those catastrophes leave traces that are subtle, easily missed, easily misinterpreted, and they may have shaped human history far more profoundly and far more frequently than we currently realize. The year 536 was, as the Harvard historian Michael McCormick put it, the beginning of one of the worst periods to be alive in human history. That phrase has been repeated so many times in articles and documentaries and YouTube videos that it has almost lost its power. But stop for a moment and let it sink in. The worst period to be alive, not the worst day, not the worst week, the worst period. A stretch of time, years, decades, more than a century, during which the basic conditions of human existence, food, warmth, safety, health, were degraded to a level that most people alive today cannot imagine. A period during which the sun itself, the source of all life and warmth and growth on this planet, turned dim and cold and strange, and the harvests failed, and the plague came, and millions of people died, and the civilizations that they had spent centuries building crumbled into dust and were replaced by something smaller, poorer, and darker. And nobody alive at the time understood why it was happening, or when it would end, or whether the sun would ever shine properly again. Imagine being the farmer from central Italy we met at the very beginning of this story, the one standing at the edge of his wheat field on that spring morning in 536, watching the sky with a growing sense of unease. He could not have known that what he was seeing, the dimming of the sun, the hazy yellow sky, the fading of the light, was the first sign of a catastrophe that would last for more than 100 years and reshape the world beyond recognition. He could not have known that a volcano had erupted somewhere far away, in a land he had never heard of, and that the invisible products of that eruption were drifting through the upper atmosphere over his head like a slow poison, settling between him and the sun, between his crops and the warmth they needed to grow, between his children and the future he had imagined for them. He knew only what he could see and feel, that the sun was dim, that the air was cold, that his wheat was not growing the way it should, and that something somewhere had gone terribly, irreversibly wrong. He was right about that. He was right about all of it. He just could not have known how right he was, or how long the wrongness would last, or how many millions of people, across how many thousands of miles, were looking up at the same dim, sickly, hazy sky and feeling the same cold, creeping fear settling into their bones. The echoes of 536 AD are everywhere in the modern world, if you know where to look for them. They are in the political map of Europe and the Middle East, which was fundamentally redrawn by the cascade of events that the volcanic winter set in motion. The fall of the Sasanian Empire, the contraction of Byzantium, the rise of the Islamic Caliphate, the consolidation of the Germanic kingdoms that would eventually become the nation-states of modern Europe. All of these transformations were shaped, enabled, or accelerated by the catastrophe that began when an unknown volcano dimmed the sun, and a bacterium called Yersinia pestis rode a flea on the back of a rat onto the docks of Constantinople. The echoes are in the English language. The Anglo-Saxon conquest of Britain, which was facilitated by the famine and plague and political collapse that the catastrophe brought to the already fragile post-Roman British world, gave us the language in which these words are written. If the sub-Roman Britons had not been weakened by the volcanic winter and its aftermath, if they had been strong enough to resist the Anglo-Saxon advance, if the British kingdoms had survived and flourished instead of retreating into the western margins of the island, the dominant language of Britain today might be a descendant of Brythonic Celtic, rather than the Germanic tongue that the Angles and Saxons brought with them from the continent. English exists, in its current form, at least in part, because of what happened in 536. The echoes are in the religious landscape of the modern world. The weakening of Byzantium and Persia by plague and famine created the conditions in which the Arab conquests of the 7th century succeeded with astonishing speed and completeness, spreading Islam from the Arabian Peninsula across North Africa, through the Middle East, into Central Asia, and eventually to the Indian subcontinent and Southeast Asia. More than 1 billion people alive today practice a religion whose geographic spread was enabled in part by a volcanic eruption that occurred a century before the Prophet Muhammad was born. The connection is indirect, mediated by a complex chain of political, military, and demographic events. But the chain begins with a volcano, and it ends with a transformed world. The echoes are in the law. Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis, the great legal code that he compiled during the Golden Age before the catastrophe, survived the disaster that destroyed almost everything else he built. It was preserved, copied, studied, and eventually transmitted to the universities of medieval Europe, where it became the foundation of civil law, the legal tradition that governs the majority of the world's countries today. Every time a court in France or Germany or Japan or Brazil applies a principle of civil law, it is applying ideas that were codified by a man who dreamed of restoring the Roman Empire and who watched that dream die in a plague that arrived on a grain ship from Egypt while the sun hung dim and blue above his golden city. And the echoes are in science. The tools that were used to solve the mystery of 536, ice core analysis, dendrochronology, geochemical fingerprinting of volcanic tephra, these tools did not exist even 50 years ago. They are products of the same scientific revolution that gave us the ability to sequence the genome of Yersinia pestis from ancient DNA extracted from the teeth of 6th century plague victims, confirming once and for all that the plague of Justinian was caused by the same organism that would later cause the Black Death of the 14th century. The story of 536 is, in many ways, a story about the power of modern science to illuminate the darkest corners of the past, to reach across 15 centuries and pull a buried catastrophe into the light, to connect a spike of sulfuric acid in a Swiss glacier to the death of an empire and the birth of a new world. We are the inheritors of 536, all of us, every single human being alive today. The languages we speak, the religions we practice, the legal systems under which we live, the political boundaries that divide our nations, the scientific methods we use to understand our own history, all of them bear the fingerprints of a year when the sun went dark, and the world broke apart at the seams and everything that came after was built, piece by piece, generation by generation, on the rubble and ash and grief of everything that came before. The people of 536 did not know they were living through a turning point in human history. They did not know that their suffering would echo down the centuries and reshape the world in ways they could never have imagined. They were just trying to survive, trying to feed their families with crops that would not grow, trying to bury their dead when the plague took them, trying to make sense of a sky that looked wrong and a sun that felt cold and a world that seemed to be coming apart at the foundations. They prayed to their gods for deliverance. They blamed their neighbors for their misfortune. They told stories around dying fires about the sins that must have brought this punishment upon them, and they wondered, with a fear that must have been almost unbearable, whether the sun would ever shine properly again. They could not have known, those frightened, hungry, bewildered people, that 1,500 years later, a team of scientists would drill a hole in a glacier high in the Swiss Alps and find the ghost of their suffering preserved in a thin, barely visible layer of sulfuric acid between two annual bands of compressed alpine snow. A whisper from the past, a chemical fingerprint of catastrophe. The story of the worst year in human history, written not in words but in molecules, and finally, after 15 centuries of silence, read by someone with the tools and the knowledge and the curiosity to understand what it meant. Close your eyes for a moment and go back to where we started. You are standing at the edge of a wheat field in central Italy. It is the spring of 536 AD. The air smells like damp earth and young green shoots and the faint mineral tang of volcanic soil. The sky above you is wrong. It is hazy, yellowish, washed out, as if someone has turned down the brightness of the world by 20% and drained the color from everything. The sun hangs above the eastern hills like a pale disk, bluish, sickly, casting shadows so soft and indistinct that they barely exist. Your wife is standing beside you, one hand resting on the curve of her belly, the baby inside her still months from being born. Your children are playing behind the house, their laughter drifting across the field in the strange, muted light. You are looking at the sky and you are afraid. You do not know that a volcano has erupted somewhere far away. You do not know about sulfur dioxide or stratospheric aerosols or the volcanic explosivity index. You do not know that the dimming you are seeing will last for 18 months, or that the crops you planted last week will not reach maturity, or that the harvest will fail, or that next year's harvest will fail too. You do not know that a bacterium called Yersinia pestis is, at this very moment, multiplying silently inside the guts of rat fleas in Central Asia, beginning a journey that will carry it along the Silk Road to the port of Pelusium in Egypt, and from there on grain ships to the harbor of Constantinople, where it will kill 10,000 people a day and be stuffed into the towers of walls that were supposed to be impregnable. You do not know any of this. You know only that the sky is wrong and the sun is cold, and you have a feeling deep in the pit of your stomach, a feeling that you cannot explain and cannot shake, that something has changed, something fundamental, something that cannot be undone. You are right, everything has changed. The world that your grandchildren will inherit will be almost unrecognizable from the world you were born into. The empire that protects you will be hollowed out by plague and famine. The trade networks that bring olive oil from Spain and silk from China to the markets in the nearest town will wither and die. The roads that the Romans built, the ones that have carried soldiers and merchants and pilgrims across this peninsula for 500 years, will crack and crumble and eventually be swallowed by the weeds and the mud. The population of Italy will fall by half and then by half again. The cities will empty. The forums will fill with rubble. The bathhouses will go cold. And out of the ruins, slowly, painfully, over centuries, something new will emerge, something different, something that you would not recognize but that will carry, in its bones and in its language and in the faded memories of its oldest stories, the ghost of everything that was lost. But tonight, none of that has happened yet. Tonight, the sun is setting behind the western hills, sinking into the haze, casting a light that is more orange than gold, more copper than amber, a light that makes the wheat field glow with an eerie, almost supernatural warmth despite the cold in the air. Your wife takes your hand and leads you back toward the house. The children have gone inside. The fire is lit. There is bread on the table and wine in the jug and the smell of something cooking in the pot over the hearth. The world is still here. It is still whole. The cracks have not yet become chasms. The sun will rise tomorrow morning, dimmer than it should be, colder than it should be, but it will rise. And you will go back to your field and check your crops and do what farmers have always done, what farmers will always do, which is to plant seeds in the earth and wait for the sun and hope that the world holds together long enough for the harvest to come. It did not that year, not the next year, not for a very long time after that, but eventually, decades later, generations later, the haze cleared and the sun came back, not all at once, not in a dramatic, golden, triumphant sunrise that swept the darkness away in a single blinding flash. Slowly, gradually. The way the world always heals, 1 degree of warmth at a time, one green shoot at a time, one healthy child born into a world that is just slightly less terrible than the one its parents were born into. The sun came back. It always does. It always will. That is the one thing that the catastrophe of 536, for all its horror, for all its destruction, for all the millions of lives it consumed, and all the civilizations it shattered, cannot change. The sun comes back. The crops grow again. The children play in the yard. The world, battered and scarred and diminished and different, goes on. If you enjoyed tonight's journey through the darkest year in human history, subscribe to our channel and we will see you in the next one. There are more stories waiting, more catastrophes, more mysteries, more moments when the Earth reminded us that we are guests here, not owners, and that the planet we live on has plans of its own. Until then, sleep well. Let the warmth settle over you. The sun is shining. The sky is clear. The harvest is coming. Good night.